Okay, so many simple reflexes involve, the peripheral nervous system in terms of sensory input, maybe a few interneurons in the spinal cord, and then motor output to the muscles. But higher cognitive functions, the kind of abilities that we are particularly interested in terms of the influence of drugs. For example, memory, attention, language, planning, or feeling, right, are going to involve the cerebrum, which is what a lot of people think of when they think of the brain. This large structure here that sits atop the spinal cord, right? And particularly areas of the outer surface of the cerebrum. The outer surface is actually a layered set of brain cells, several layers of cells that we refer to as the cortex. And when you look at the side of the brain like this, right, your eyeballs would be out here. This is the back of your head, right? These sort of surface regions that you can see here that are don't have a line through them, these are actually regions of cortex, which means bark in Latin, that you can actually observe on the outer surface of the brain. When you see these lines, like for example this sort of deep line here, this represents where the cortex actually descends below the surface, right, and then is continuous, comes back out, and then reaches the surface again. So these areas where you can see the cortex on the surface, these are referred to as gyri. A single one is a gyrus. And these lines, which represent the infolding, basically, of the cortex below the surface, and then comes back out, these are called sulci. That's a sulcus. And the reason we have sulci and gyri is actually you can fit a great deal more cortex in an enclosed space, right, by sort of folding it up like this. Organisms that are not as advanced, in terms of their behavior, or in terms of their ability to remember, attend, speak, plan, feeling, etc., tend to have smoother cortex with fewer sulci. Now, higher cognitive functions involve the cortex, and if we're going to start examining the cortex in the context of what different regions do, it helps us structurally divide up the cortex. Okay, and for many years it was taught that there were 4 lobes of the brain, but it turns out that there are 5 rather significant regions of cortex that we separated to these 5 lobes. So the one that's towards the front, right, that's the most anterior here, is referred to as the frontal lobe. This is behind your eyes. You've got your frontal lobe, and the frontal lobe is particularly extensive in primates and particularly in humans. This is where a lot of evolutionary growth has sort of accrued, is in the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe sort of extends from the front of the brain here, and there's this deep sulcus that you see called the central sulcus. It's pretty centrally located, and everything in front of that central sulcus is referred to as the frontal lobe, and behind that central sulcus is what we call the parietal lobe. Okay? Now, as you head further back to the back of the head, you're gonna run into what we refer to as the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is the border between the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe is not as clear as the frontal parietal border at the central sulcus. And that's also true when you jump from the occipital lobe and start to go forward into what we refer to as the temporal lobe, sort of below your temples, right? The temporal lobe sort of extends all the way out here, beneath the frontal and parietal lobes, okay? So those are 4 lobes, and that's sort of the 4 traditional lobes. But there's another lobe of cortex that's particularly important as it relates to drugs, because it's an area of the brain that's going to map a great deal of what's going on inside of your body. And, one of the things that drugs do is they make you feel different, right? Or many drugs can make you feel different. So this particular lobe is going to play a significant role. So what I want you to get a sense of, here's another side view of the cerebrum. Here's our frontal lobe, our parietal lobe, our occipital lobe, our temporal lobe. What we've done here is we've cut away big sections of the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. And below here we've revealed another area of cortex, another area of bark below here. This is referred to as the insula. The insular lobe is also going to play a pretty significant role in networks that are involved in response to drugs.